Over the last decade, Five Nights at Freddy's has gone from a developer's final shot at success to one of the most important and influential modern gaming brands. With the first 7 games in the series totaling to nearly 12 million copies sold on Steam alone, it's no surprise whatsoever that the haunted animatronic-focused franchise would be adapted to film eventually. However, its journey to the big screen was long and confusing, and its eventual release for many fans of the games brought more questions than answers. Welcome to Game Rant. My name is Cameron, and today we'll be taking a definitive look at the history, story, and canonicity of the Five Nights at Freddy's film. To understand how we got the final production we got, we need to take a look back at where the series began. Fans of the franchise know this story all too well, but for those uninitiated, Five Nights at Freddy's was originally supposed to be a final chance at redemption for series creator Scott Cawthon after his previous releases flew under the radar of most critics and prospective players. After receiving bounds of criticism for his character's eerie and unsettling, almost animatronic designs, he decided to play into the criticism and create a horror game, something he had no prior experience with, and thus, Five Nights at Freddy's was born. Just 4 days after its release, YouTuber Markiplier filmed his first video on the game, immediately sending the game's popularity skyrocketing, and over the next 8 months, developer Scott Cawthon would release 2 more games in the franchise. Roughly 1 month following the release of Five Nights at Freddy's 3 in April of 2015, it was announced that the film rights to the franchise had been secured by Warner Brothers, with major names in the horror world like Roy Lee and a pre-It era David Katzenberg set to produce the project. About a year later, Gil Kenan signed on to direct and write the project with co-writer Tyler Burton Smith, and from there, it was full steam ahead. Until it wasn't. Sometime between Gil Kenan signing on as director and March 2017, the project was placed in the turnaround, colloquially known as development hell. The creators of the project weren't quite sure where to take the film, and Warner Brothers no longer wanted to be at the helm. The project was scooped up by Blumhouse. Scott Cawthon got to work closer with the production team, and director Gil Kenan stepped off the project to make way for its new director, Chris Columbus, the mind behind the first 2 Harry Potter films, Home Alone, Mrs. Doubtfire, and a plethora of other movies from your childhood. The script for this iteration of the movie was penned by Cawthon and Kira Breed Risley, the author of the Silver Eyes trilogy of FNAF books. The first draft was finished and the project was officially slated for a 2020 release, and then, once again, radio silence for the following year. As fans waited in anticipation for the trailer to drop, nothing would come until August of 2018, when Scott would announce the project would be delayed, which he took full responsibility for, citing a new idea for the story which he much preferred. For the most part, it would be silent in the intervening years, a statement or two from Jason Blum, but not much else. At this point, many fans of the franchise, including myself, believed the project to be dead in the water. That is, until November of 2020 when Scott would put out one of the most fascinating Reddit posts in recent years. Initially framed as a bad news post, Scott would go over some of the now scrapped screenplays for the film before ultimately announcing that the bad news is that there would no longer be additions to the scrapped screenplay list, as they'd finally landed on their perfect script, and that the movie was set to start filming in spring of 2021. While some of these screenplays don't offer much to explain what we see in the final product, I think it's worth taking a quick detour through a few of them so you can get a better idea of why this project took so long to make and where a few of its biggest criticisms stem from, but I can't recommend reading the full post enough. It's fascinating and has a ton of insights on what it takes to make a franchise-based screenplay. The Silver Eyes screenplays were a series of screenplays written by Cawthon and Breed Risley that attempted to adapt the first book of the Silver Eyes trilogy directly to film to better serve longtime fans of the franchise. But Cawthon's inexperience in screenwriting at the time made these screenplays suffer, and ultimately the duo decided to focus solely on the game story instead. The Random Charlie screenplay was a more original take on the story, still using names and the general plot elements fans had come to know and love, but ultimately was its own original story. This one was scrapped after realizing that the story deviated a little too far, becoming, quote, a random bag of FNAF elements with no real stakes. The Cassidy screenplay was on the opposite end of the game accuracy bell curve from the Random Charlie screenplay, diving deep into the lore of the franchise, spanning decades of FNAF story and the characters within it. While Scott believes this would have been satisfying for longtime fans of the franchise, it was ultimately scrapped for being too alienating toward moviegoers who weren't FNAF historians. And finally, this doesn't have much relevance to the final product, but there was a screenplay titled Plushies Take Manhattan, and the only detail he gave on that screenplay was that it was scrapped because, quote, the plushies took Manhattan. I would give genuinely anything to get my hands on that one. The post concluded with one final screenplay titled the Mike screenplay. It checked all the right boxes, was satisfying for longtime fans and those new to the franchise, and was given the green light by Scott to be pushed to production, being the story we would eventually see on the big screen. Spring of 2021 came and went with no new news. And in September, it was announced that director Chris Columbus had stepped away from the project, which would ultimately be the final piece of bad news for the project, as 1 year later, everything was finally back on track for a release. For real this time. In 2022, Jim Henson's Creature Shop was tapped to build the animatronics we'd all come to know and love. Emma Tommy, director of 2018's indie horror darling The Wind, was tapped to direct the film. Josh Hutcherson and Matthew Lillard joined the cast as two of its lead, and filming finally began in New Orleans in February of 2013, nearly 8 years after the film's original announcement. I think it's important to know how drastically different the series looked by the time this movie came out compared to when it was initially announced. When the movie rights were bought by Warner Bros. All the way back in 2015, Scott was in the process of making what was intended to be the fourth and final game in the franchise. The lore was not coherent, it had countless loose threads that not even the fourth game would tie up. I mean, seriously, the name William Afton, the big bad of the franchise, hadn't been used in the games until October of 2016, over a year after the film was announced. We're now a decade into this franchise. There are 11 mainline games, 8 spin-off games, 23 novels, and 9 graphic novels, all with their own stories and timelines and canons that are heavily debated by fans of the series. The in-universe timeline of events is a total mess, and yet, sitting here ready to be picked apart is 2023's Five Nights at Freddy's movie, which for the most part, wears its heart on its sleeve. With all that backstory out of the way, it's time to take a deep dive into the film we did get, the Mike screenplay, so we can dissect it and compare it to not only the screenplays that came before, but the game itself. We'll break this down into 3 sections: characters and story, aesthetics, and Easter eggs. The film, despite having a rather large cast of characters, centers mostly around the dynamic between 4 characters: Mike Schmidt, the male lead, Vanessa Shelley, the female lead, Abby, Mike's little sister, and William Afton, the villain. Of these 4 characters, 3 of them have direct game parallels, with Abby being the only character without a clear and obvious connection to the franchise, though some do speculate her name being a nickname for Elizabeth or maybe even an anagram for baby, as in Circus Baby, one of the most important characters in the games. This connection is tenuous at best, and I'll be ignoring it, not only for brevity, but also because it's extremely annoying and would throw off the rest of the character connections. Sorry, Abby truthers, you'll get them next time. The most important of the other 3 for piecing together the game's connection to the film is, of course, the purple guy himself, William Afton, the only character of the 4 whose movie depiction lines up nearly perfectly with his in-game one, with the exception of using the alias Steve Raglan, which most closely lines up with his depiction in the Silver Eyes book series. Much like in the film, game timeline William Afton is a co-founder of Fazbear Entertainment, one who would go on to ruthlessly end the lives of roughly 12 children, some in cold blood, some out of rage, and some on the quest to resurrect his daughter by physically harvesting the soul energy of innocent children using something called a remnant extractor, which is absolutely getting into the weeds, and I pray I don't need to talk about it for the rest of this video, but spoiler alert, I will. I'll give you a heads up when it happens, but I'll be brief, I promise. Despite being the primary antagonist of the series, very little is spelled out when it comes to William's personality and intentions, especially when it comes to the pre-spring locking version we see in the film. There is genuinely only one piece of dialogue in the entire franchise pre-FNAF movie confirmed to have come from an alive and well Afton, that being the opening cutscene of the 5th game in the main series, Sister Location, in which we hear William being questioned by what we now know is a board member of Fazbear Entertainment.
There are just certain design choices that were made for these robots that we don't fully understand. We were hoping that you could shed some light on those.
She can dance. She can sing. She's equipped with a built-in helium tank for inflating balloons right at her fingertips. She can take song requests. She can even dispense ice cream.
With all due respect, those aren't the design choices we were curious about, Mr. Afton.
Don't ask why he's British, it doesn't make sense to me either, and they never explain it. What we do know about William Afton pre-spring locking is, in all honesty, very bare bones. We know for a fact he took the lives that inhabited the FNAF 1 animatronics, the one seen in the film. We know his son, the crying child, or as he's recently come to be known, Dave Afton, was accidentally killed in an incident in 1983 involving a prank gone wrong, one conducted by his other son, none other than Mike Afton Schmidt. Bear with me, things are about to get a lot more confusing, but I promise when we come out of the other end, we'll feel fresh and informed. His story in the movie is pretty consistent with that of the games, with a few small details flipped. The majority of the changes come in the form of personality given to the character. Overall, the creators of the FNAF movie didn't get a ton to work with when it comes to William, which I think explains the lack of screen time he gets, with all of his scenes totaling to roughly 10 minutes combined. That being said, it also gives him a certain level of free reign. Matthew Lillard embodies this role with such charisma and energy and clear love for what he's doing that in my eyes, it's honestly the best version of the character and the one I want to see in the games going forward, which is a rarity in the modern game-to-movie adaptation scene. There's a lot to say about Mike Schmidt, mostly in that this adaptation of the character is wildly different from the one in the game. Mike Schmidt in the games is a security guard of the FNAF 1 pizzeria, and that's about where film Mike and game Mike split. Why? The rest of Mike's characterization in the games is instead given to Vanessa in this movie. In the games, Mike Schmidt is an alias used by Michael Afton, the previously mentioned son who accidentally killed his little brother in the bite of 83. Common consensus is that Mike took the job at the FNAF 1 location to try and find his father. Mike Afton at the time of taking the alias Mike Schmidt is being kept alive solely by possessing his own hollowed-out, decaying body, which doesn't quite seem to be the case here. Mike Schmidt in the movies instead gets the chance to shine as his own unique character, a pseudo stand-in for the audience, his love for his sister being the guiding force for his actions instead of being driven by a sick desire to hunt down his murderous father. This movie has tons of parallels and connections to the games, but they're mostly manifest in Vanessa and the moment-to-moment action of the film. There's not too much to say about Mike Schmidt otherwise. He's raising his sister as his own child, he's loyal, caring, and desperate to find answers to his brother's disappearance. Vanessa, on the other hand, Vanessa is one of the most fascinating video game character adaptations of all time. She is simultaneously adapting multiple characters at once, Vanessa from Security Breach and Michael Afton from the original series. In Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach, Vanessa is an overnight security guard at the Pizzaplex. She serves as an unwitting servant to a now technologically reincarnated William Afton, taking form of the bunny-costumed Vanny as the primary antagonist of the game. In the film, her role takes some of the same cues. Instead of being a metaphorical continuation of Afton, she is the literal offspring of Afton, his daughter. Vanessa Afton is a police officer, using her role in the police force as a cover for her crimes in service of her father, a clear parallel to Michael's servitude in the game series, working across the different FNAF locations over the years, assuming pseudonyms to hide his true life and purpose for employment, before ultimately betraying his father to help the missing kids. There's not too much more to go over when it comes to the core cast, which means we can finally hop into aesthetics. Whatever gripes I may have had with the story changes and clunkiness of their execution, it gets the tone and aesthetic nearly perfect. Everything from the animatronics to the pizzeria itself are oozing with the same run-down, oppressive feeling of the original game. Cramped corridors, mired in darkness, give the impression that despite the relative openness of the interior, there's nowhere to run to. Emma Tommy chooses to avoid the dread of the original game, choosing instead to play to the viewer's sense of familiarity, the nostalgic side of the series rather than the horror side. Booths are backed by stained glass portraits of the main cast. Carpets on the floor use classic 80s patterns like those that dominated our childhood arcades, bowling alleys, and theaters, and arcade hits like Centipede and Asteroids line the walls. The layout of the pizzeria itself is almost entirely different, which is understandable given the FNAF 1 pizzeria makes no sense. There wouldn't be much to show from the first game's establishment, just a few empty tables in Pirate's Cove. The movie's pizzeria is drastically different. It's expansive almost to a fault. I really can't explain why it would need multiple areas dedicated to the disassembly and repair of animatronics, the area that Mike and Ness have a conversation in, and the room that Max gets chomped in. Speaking of the room Max gets chomped in, what is this object? The fans have decided to nickname it Shreddy Faz Chair. Haha, very funny, but what is its purpose? My best guess is a remnant extractor, something built to torture an unwitting person to the point of death to produce an emotion strong enough that it would bond their souls to the physical world surrounding them. That being said, it's never seen in the games, nor the books, and is a very weird tone shift given the otherwise normal-looking establishment and crew. The animatronics themselves are pulled nearly one-to-one from the game, down to the wear and tear spotted on the cloth adorning the animatronics. This is almost certainly thanks to the incredibly talented team over at Jim Henson's Creature Shop, who absolutely nailed their designs. If anything, the movie gives us a rare look at how this generation of animatronics look in action, as the first several games use still images to show their movement through their facilities. Despite over 10 games, we'd never gotten to see this animatronic band actually perform until this film, and the movie executes it in a way that feels wholly believable. These characters were born to be brought to life on the big screen. The sense of scale when looking at the animatronics next to the human characters is felt in a way that only the VR adaptations, Help Wanted and Help Wanted 2, were able to accomplish. The movie isn't as concerned with perfect game accuracy as it is the feeling of game accuracy, which only works to the movie's benefit. The only hiccup when it comes to aesthetic matching with the game is the dream sequences. In the games, the ghosts of the children are commonly seen as, well, ghosts. In this movie, they're full-body apparitions that can talk, emote, and manipulate. Only one shot in the movie portrays them as they are in the games. This one jump scare of the Foxy kid crying inky black tears with pitch black eyes. This is the aesthetic of the game series Ghost, as goofy as it may look in action. And finally, let's dig into the Easter eggs, the real deep cuts for the eagle-eyed fans who want some of that sweet, sweet fan service. Following the cold open action sequence, this film's title credits begin, harkening back to the series' long-standing tradition of 8-bit minigames, but this time showing the missing children's incident in action. Retro sprites of William Afton lead kids away to their inevitable deaths one by one, shining light on an event that the franchise usually only speaks about in hushed tones. Classic franchise moments from jump scare sounds to fan theories are all brought to life throughout the movie's runtime. Take, for instance, Chica's Cupcake. In the games, it's been implied that Afton lured one of the children, Susie, to her death by taking her dog and convincing her that it was alive and well, only to be seen again if she followed him and took the dog home herself, only to arrive and meet the same fate as her dog before having her body shoved inside the Chica animatronic, her soul possessing her new metal housing. Chica's cupcake, however, seemed to also come to life, being a more erratic and wild counter to Chica's relative tameness. Thanks to some handy sound effects used when the cupcake attacks in this movie, it's all but confirmed the cupcake was possessed by Susie's dog. Was the dog's body shoved into the cupcake? What are the mechanics of its possession? Who cares? It's cool. Another longtime fan theory that's cleverly brought to canon is Sparky the dog. Originally created to trick fans into believing there was a sixth animatronic in the game, a photoshopped image of a brown dog animatronic hit the web and became the first prevalent hoax in the franchise. The creators of the movie wanted to honor the role this hoax played in the franchise, not only by including the full Sparky costume in the background, but by including Sparky's Diner with prominent, now retired FNAF theorist Matt Pat working as a server. Possibly the most gratifying piece of fan service in the entire film, Foxy's jump scare is faithfully brought to life. His original voice actor returned to deliver his classic menacing hum before Foxy sprints full speed down the hallway and the FNAF 1 jump scare sound plays. As the movie's big bad finally gets defeated, Emma, Tommy, and Cawthon decide to do a rundown of some of Afton's most iconic moments. He shouts his most iconic phrase, and dons the head of the suit he would come to spend the rest of the games in, and begins violently shaking and jerking to mimic the FNAF 3 trailer. To wrap things up, there's a few Easter eggs that point towards the next film, specifically its flagship animatronics. Balloon Boy from Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is seen in miniature form as a recurring jumpscare gag throughout the movie, and as the film draws to a close, moments before the credits end, the song Grandfather Clock, which served as the puppet's music box theme in FNAF 2, begins to play as the voice from FNAF 2 Save Them minigames eerily calls out "Come find me" letter by letter. Overall, the movie wildly strays away from the source material in all of the right places, and some of the wrong ones. But its dedication to delivering a parallel to the game's world in a way that longtime fans and newcomers alike would understand must be applauded. It's not a perfect video game adaptation, it's far from it, but its creation in history is the gold standard of how a video game adaptation should be made. The creators of the game should be involved all throughout, with respect to the source material shining through. It's the same thing that made The Last of Us a success, same with Mortal Kombat and even the Super Mario Bros. Movie. As the industry leans more and more toward game adaptations being the next big thing, I hope the people bringing them to life learn from the success of these adaptations and keep the creators of this story at the forefront. Thank you for watching Game Rant. I'm Cameron. We'll see you next time.